now we need to turn our attention to the issue of corporate governance. We've talked about the other topics that relate to this, okay, but here we're going to focus in on a specific element of corporate governance primarily, and that's going to be the role of the board of directors. So there's lots of governance issues that surround the corporation, and there's many angles that we could come at that from. But here we're going to talk about the bigger picture, but we're really going to focus on this idea of the board of directors and the role of the board of directors in the corporation or within the governance structure. So if you want to have a really long definition, so corporate governance system, well, it's a system of principles, policies, procedures, blah, blah, blah. You can read that if you want. I suggest you commit it to memory for the exam. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so this is just saying that, look, we have a corporate governance system that's going to define who is responsible for what. There's going to be accountability. There's going to be monitoring. There's going to be a way to resolve conflicts. And that's what we mean by corporate governance. So it is within the corporation. What is the governance structure? How do we make decisions? How do we deal with conflicts? So the objectives of corporate governance, of course, are to, well, we really would like to eliminate conflicts of interest, but eliminate or reduce conflicts of interest to keep them at a minimum. In the real world, complete elimination of conflicts of interest, especially in the modern corporation, is probably not feasible, but we ought to minimize them, and we ought to know how to handle them when they do occur. So we want to ensure that the company assets are used for the best in the best interest of the investors. So the people that own the corporation, well, these company assets, okay, well, the shareholders, we want them to have the benefit of owning this particular company. So core attributes for an effective system, and we want to define what are the shareholder rights. So some of this is defined in the legal system, so you don't see it anywhere anymore, but we had shareholders for a long time had the right to maintain their level of ownership in the firm if we were issuing new shares, all that sort of stuff, the preemptive right. That's been written out of most corporate charters, but that would be a type of shareholder right that is determined by the state of incorporation in the U.S. or something along those lines. So we also want to define what are the rights of shareholders within our corporation. So there would be something that is determined at the corporate level. We want to define the oversight responsibilities, so who's looking over whose shoulder. We want to provide fair and equitable treatment for all of the stakeholders of the firm. And we want transparency and accuracy in disclosures, right? So again, light is a great disinfectant. We want to be able to see what's going on, and we want to make it so that we have some transparency to the decision process, the outcomes. That's going to make for a better corporate governance system. So business form is going to determine, to some extent, the conflicts that we're going to have to deal with. So if we're talking about a sole proprietorship, right, that's just, you know, I own a business. So in fact, I do own a business. So I own this business. Well, I'm the owner. I'm the manager. I, in this case, was the only shareholder, or I guess the only owner, only equity stakeholder. I was also the only creditor of the business. Well, there was no separation of ownership, okay, and management. Okay, well, what does that mean? There still could be conflicts of interest. That's between, you know, creditors and suppliers. So, you know, there could be some conflicts there. That's really not what we're talking about. Okay, what if we move to a partnership? The business I'm actually talking about, I took on 2 partners, and so there's 3 of us now, but we are all, you know, equal owners in the entity. So there again is no separation of ownership and management. So again, we can think of conflicts with creditors or conflicts with suppliers. Okay, but the primary issue that we want to deal with is when there's a conflict between the ownership of the company and management, and sole proprietorships, partnerships don't produce any of that, right? What does, at least the main villain here, is going to be a corporation. I shouldn't say a villain. It's one of the great things, one of the great advances of society. But this is a distinct legal entity. It can sue and be sued, all that sort of stuff. So a corporation, distinct legal entity. But what happens, especially as you think of the modern corporation, okay, well, we're going to have conflicts of interest between shareholders and the management of the firm, and potentially the board of directors, right? So we want to talk about those separately. The one that comes up most frequently and that we most lament in a broader sense is the conflict between shareholders and managers, and it's the separation of ownership and control that drives that, right? So we think, again, if I own 1/100 millionth of Apple, then you know, I'm an owner, I'm a shareholder, I'm a principal. Okay, and do I like what management is doing? Well, no, but do I take the initiative to monitor them and, you know, tell them what they should be doing? Well, I would bear all the cost of monitoring, but I would only benefit to 1/100 millionth of it, right? So whatever the outcome was. So we have this separation of ownership and control, shareholders versus managers. Managers are taking too many perks, whatever it happens to be. That's a very common manifestation of this, what we're ultimately going to call an agency problem. What we're going to address more completely here is this idea of conflict of interest between shareholders and the people that are supposed to be representing them, that is, the board of directors. So is the board actually going to go in and do what it's supposed to do, and that is that it looks over management's shoulder to make sure that management is acting in the best interest of the shareholders. So agency relationships. And again, we see this elsewhere in the curriculum. The principal is the owner, the agency is the manager. There's this asymmetric information that occurs because the managers are the ones that are talking to the research scientists, dealing with the patent lawyers, you know, talking to the tax accountants, you know, interviewing the senators or having lunch with the senators or whatever it happens to be. So the principal-agent problem here is that the agents can act for their own benefit rather than the principal's benefit. So they have a, you know, a third corporate jet or an eighth corporate jet. They've got new retreats. They got 5 secretaries, none of whom can type. Those types of things. That's going to be excessive perks that they take. That is a positive argument in their personal utility function. They're happier because of it, but that's because they have all the shareholders are out there who are paying for it. Okay, so again, managers versus shareholders. We see some discussion of that elsewhere in the curriculum, and it's important in this reading as well, but it's these directors versus shareholders that we want to spend most of our time on as we go through this reading. So managers versus shareholders, a real quick summary as we've seen before, but the agent unwisely expands the size of the firm. So that is, you know, takes on lots of mergers. Why? Because if you have a bigger firm, you can make more money. Or if you have a bigger firm, you're more likely to get your picture on the cover of Forbes, and then your mother thinks that you're such a bright young boy or young girl. Then you know, you can expand the size of the firm, and if the returns to shareholders are good, well, that doesn't really matter. Okay, excessive compensation, perks. You know, here's the 3 secretaries joke. Okay, you can have management taking too much risk. Well, this is a firm that is, you know, it's a smaller firm now. I enjoy it, but if we, you know, take on this new production process or implement this new system, well, it's really risky. But if it works, it's going to be a home run. If it doesn't work, it's going to, you know, it's going to cause the company to go down in flames. Well, that's somebody else's money if I'm the manager, right? So it's heads I win. Tails the stockholders lose. Well, I'll take that bet just about any day. So give me your money. I'll be happy to take it to Vegas and gamble it for you. All right? Okay, there's on the other side of that, we could also have managers that don't take enough risk. Why? Because they've got things the way they want them. They've got a big salary. They've got their picture on the cover of Forbes. They've got their 3 secretaries or however many it is. And they just don't want to rock the boat too much. And while this might be a value add, in other words, an expectation, this is a positive net present value project. And if you're a diversified shareholder, you own shares in hundreds of companies, then you would want them to do this. But they don't want to do it. That is, the managers don't want to do it because all of their human capital is tied up in one company. Right? Yours is spread out over hundreds, so they may do make some decisions where they don't take enough risk just because they want to protect what they currently have going. Okay, so if we're looking at directors versus shareholders, well, the problem here is that we could have a lack of independence. And again, this is an issue that's shown up elsewhere, but a lack of independence means that the managers the board members are more aligned with management than they are with the shareholders. So way down here at the bottom of the slide, you can see that this is the problem we're trying to avoid. The board of directors, their job is to ensure that corporate assets and the corporation itself is governed in a way that the shareholders benefit. Right? So we're supposed to maximize the wealth of the shareholders. That's the sort of the traditional mantra of corporate finance. Well, if the board of directors is not independent, right? They don't make independent decisions. They're aligned with the management team. Okay, well, that's going to mean that they're not going to be good overseers, right? So board members, if they have a personal relationship with management, so they're drinking buddies from college or whatever it happened to be, they're members, board members that have consulting agreements or interlinked boards. Well, if you're you're a member of the board of directors and you're also the president and chief or principal shareholder in another company that's a big supplier to the firm you're serving on the board, that is where you serve as the board is a big customer of yours, well, that's going to cause you to have different incentives because you don't want management to get mad and decide not to buy product from your firm anymore, right? So if the directors are overcompensated, that is, well, we're going to pay you a whole lot of money for very little work, well, then you don't want to rock the boat, right? So, okay, I'm a director, I want to be compensated for my time and my expertise, but if you compensate me more than I think I'm worth, then I'm going to say, well, I don't want to give up this gig because this is how I'm paying for my condo in Vail, right? So anyway, so the problem is that these agency relationships between the directors and the shareholders, okay, the base or bottom line issue is, where does their loyalty lie? Are they aligned with management? Are they going to do what management wants to do? Or are they aligned with shareholders? So, and of course, they're supposed to be aligned with shareholders. So, responsibilities of the board, okay, they're supposed to institute these corporate values. They're supposed to create a long-term strategic objectives for the firm, determine what are management's responsibilities within that long-term plan, ensure that we have complete and accurate information. We're going to see this come up in a couple of areas. They, of course, should be meeting regularly, and they should ensure that the other board members are trained. I think all these things are pretty intuitive, right? So what we see for these next couple of slides, I think 3 slides, is what I would call a best practices if you are creating a board of directors, right? So if you want to say, does this, and we're going to, at the end, we're going to talk about outcomes and the quality of governance and the quality of the board. Well, what is it that would make you say, oh, this firm is going to has good governance versus bad governance? Well, if we had these best practices in place, we would have more confidence that the board was operating in a way that would keep the shareholders' interests high in the trade-offs between all the different stakeholders out there, right? So first of all is the compensation of the board, and that is that you want 75% of the directors to be independent. Independent means they don't have any relationship with the firm other than their board service, so they're not consultants, they're not interlinked boards, they're just they're people that were hired because they are smart, because they understand the industry, understand business, and that's what they do. They don't have any other issues. So we want, as we've seen elsewhere, we want to have an independent chairman. So you don't want a chairman CEO. CEO is an operating officer. A chairman is a board officer. So the chairman and CEO, you used to see that frequently combined. It's sort of an honorary thing very frequently. Oh, we're going to make you not only CEO but also chairman of the board. Well, if you want to have independent control of the board's agenda, then you have to have an independent chairman. So you want qualified directors. So again, let's get rid of the drinking buddies, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, that sort of type of thing. Your election process. So you want an election process that's going to allow or enable the market for corporate control to function. And what that means is, if you think of, okay, when I get elected to the board, there's 7 members. Each one's going to serve for 14 years, and it's going to be a staggered term. So, every 2 years somebody comes up for election. That's, of course, the structure of the Federal Reserve Board, but Board of Directors, Board of Governors. But anyway, that would be as bad as it could be for election procedures for a corporation. Why? Because if the firm is performing terribly, because no one will bring management to heel, well, then it's going to take how many years for you to get control of the board? Well, you're going to have 4 out of 7, so you're going to have 6 or 8 years that you have to wait in order to take over the board, in order to, kick out management, that type of thing. So, board self-assessment practices. So, how do they evaluate their own accomplishments? And then the frequency of sessions just for the independent board members. So, we know who's independent, we know who is part of management, and the independent directors should at least annually meet without the insiders to the firm. Why? Because you don't want them to feel constrained or timid about talking about, well, we need to change this, or this performance isn't good, and it's somebody else's baby. So the audit committee. This is the audit committee is the committee that hires and receives the report from the auditors, for instance, the external auditors. And this is going to be something that is only going to be occupied by independent directors. There was a time when the board would say we're going to have a committee of the whole, meaning that the entire board would be the audit committee. Well, we don't want management on the audit committee. Why? Because management is the one that's responsible for preparing the financial statements. If we're paying someone a lot of money to come in and audit them, well, we don't want the preparer of the financial statement to be hiring and cozied up with the people that are supposed to be looking over their shoulder. So we want independent directors on the audit committee. The nominating committee, that is who are we going to nominate for future board positions. Okay, the compensation committee, okay, the thing to remember here is these are the people that determine the compensation of top management. And the big thing they discuss is we want to link compensation with performance. So if we can link those two things, we're going to do better. And then the use of independent expert legal counsel. There was a time when it wasn't completely unheard of to have a board use house counsel as their counsel. So here's the chief counsel for the corporation. They'd also be the board's counsel. Well, the board is going to have independent legal counsel these days. And you'll notice that a lot of these things are actually, in the United States, codified under Sarbanes-Oxley, right? So if you're familiar with Sarbanes-Sarbox. So a few more things here under best practices. Statement of governance policies. So we ought to have, there ought to be a statement about how we do this. We need some idea of how we're going to disclose, what's going to be disclosed. And then we're going to have insider or related party transactions. So what if you want to sell a corporate asset to an insider? Okay, well, that's an insider related party transaction. Okay, well, how does that get resolved? What is the materiality threshold? When does it require board level involvement? Those types of things. And then finally, the responsiveness to shareholder votes, shareholder proxy votes. Is the board willing to, are they responsible to the general body of shareholders, or are they just more aligned with management and they kind of brush off the idea of an individual shareholder or group of shareholders having influence at the shareholder meeting, for instance? So corporate governance policies, again, I don't think this is the place to linger, but you're going to need a code of ethics. So firms will have a code of ethics. You're going to need some directors' oversight and monitoring, and of course you're going to need a report on that each year. And that, of course, is part of Sarbox as well. Management's responsibility to the board. So what is it that management has to do? Well, they've got to prepare financial statements. They've got to prepare, all the other things that the board asks for. So again, board self-assessments, management's performance assessment. Actually, that would probably be an asterisk rather than just a check, because that's going to go in line with the idea of compensation. And then new directors have to receive some training because they need to know who the players are in the management team and those types of issues. So corporate governance issues or corporate governance policies, these are all things that are probably going to be explicitly stated. And you can think of this as attributes of the corporate governance structure of a firm that an analyst evaluating the company would want to assess. So what do board self-assessments look like? What does the board specify as their role in monitoring? What does the code of ethics look like? And of course, what we want is a board that expresses this code of ethics or creates a code of ethics and then builds a culture around compliance with it. Okay, what about ESG risks? So environmental, social, and governance risks. So these are risks that come from environmental factors, social factors, or governance factors. So legislative, regulatory risk. Well, you can think in the United States of the tobacco industry, so more and more regulation, more taxation, those types of things. Legal risk, this is going to be, what is going to be the legal environment in a country where, in the U.S., it's going to be more litigious than it is in lots of environments. So legal risk, how is that going to change through time? Reputational risk, you can think of BP and the oil spill / disaster in the Gulf a couple of years back. So reputational risk associated with those environmental factors. And then operating risk, financial risk are going to flow from a number of different factors, environmental, social, or governance structure stuff. And all of these things are something that are factors that are going to are going to impact the overall profitability of the company and its long-term success. So to the extent that you can, as an analyst, anticipate where these changes are going to occur, so you can think of social changes. If you live in the first world, you're worried about the aging of society. How is that going to change the risks faced by different corporations or different industries? Well, that would be one aspect of evaluating this ESG risk for a different company. Okay, now what about corporate governance and company value? And I've actually never seen a study that I thought was well done that verified this, but nonetheless, they're going to assert this like it's true, and we're going to go along with it, at least for exam day. So, firms with strong or effective corporate governance systems have higher profitability. Let's think of that as higher ROE, ROA, margins, net margins, those types of things. And they're also going to say higher returns. And I don't quite see how that is possible. But nonetheless, if you have strong governance, you got higher profitability, higher returns. If you think about that too much, it'll drive you crazy. So I would just say go with it. On the other hand, if you have weak or ineffective governance system, that's going to lead to increased risk, reduction in value, and in extreme cases, there's the Arthur Andersen example, right? So bankruptcy or Enron, right? You had very ineffective corporate governance systems, and that led to very, very bad outcomes for everybody involved, but in particular for the shareholders. And that brings us to the wrap-up slide for this little corporate governance reading. So, the core objectives, we started out talking about what the corporate governance was going to do. We talked about agency conflicts. In particular, we spent a little bit of time talking about shareholder and management, which is the dominant theme. If you're going to talk about agency costs, that's the one that normally gets specified. Here, however, we're interested in taking that putting that under a little finer microscope and saying, let's think about conflicts between the shareholders and the board of directors. So what are the attributes of a good board or a good corporate governance structure? And then I think the most obvious thing in here that shows up as really easy to test would be to think about the best practices for the board. How do you put a board together that is going to be really effective? So I think this is material that's easy to get on top of. If you spend a few minutes on this, I think you'll find that that gets you some traction if it shows up on the exam.